I'd always been drawn to old buildings, their history and stories hidden beneath layers of dust and decay. That's why, when the opportunity arose to work as a night janitor at St. Michael's Church, I jumped at it. The job promised solitude and a steady paycheck, but I quickly discovered that the church had a dark and mysterious past, one that was all too eager to make itself known. It was during my second month on the job that I first heard about the church's eerie reputation. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, mentioning disappearances and strange occurrences that seemed to haunt the old edifice. I'd listened with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, convinced that the stories were exaggerated. But as the weeks went by, I began to question my initial dismissal. The church itself was a sprawling, Gothic structure, its tall spires piercing the sky. The interior was just as grand, with vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that filtered the light into somber hues. Most of the time, it was silent, save for the occasional groan of the old wooden pews or the whisper of the wind through broken panes. It wasn't until one particular night that I began to understand why so many had been unnerved by the place. It was a stormy night, and the rain battered against the windows with a relentless fury. I was alone in the sanctuary, sweeping the floor while the wind howled outside. The storm added an extra layer of disquiet to the already unsettling atmosphere. The shadows in the church seemed to stretch and writhe with the flickering candlelight. As I worked, I noticed a change in the air, a kind of electric tension that made my skin crawl. At first, it was just a low hum, barely audible over the storm. I dismissed it as the wind or the building settling, but as I moved closer to the altar, the noise grew louder and more distinct. It was the sound of an organ playing, a haunting, discordant melody that seemed to come from nowhere. I knew the organ had been silent when I arrived, and the sudden intrusion of music was both eerie and inexplicable. "Great, just what I needed," I muttered, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping over me. I made my way to the organ, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The music was loud now, filling the room with its mournful notes. My flashlight revealed the organ's keys moving ever so slightly, though no one was near it. I reached out to check the control panel, but everything was in the off position. "Who's messing with this?" I called out, though I knew no one else was supposed to be there. The music stopped as suddenly as it had started, plunging the church back into an oppressive silence. I turned to leave, but a sense of being watched lingered. The statues that lined the sanctuary seemed to cast unsettling shadows, their eyes following my every move. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. As I continued my work, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like distant echoes of a conversation I couldn't quite make out. But they grew louder and more insistent. "Why are you here?" the voices seemed to ask. "What do you want?" I tried to ignore the whispers, but they were relentless. I moved to the old chapel at the back of the church, hoping to find some respite. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long, wavering shadows. It was there that I found something out of place, a large, ornate mirror covered in dust. I didn't remember seeing it before, and its presence in the abandoned room struck me as odd. "What's this doing here?" I wondered aloud, wiping the dust from the mirror's surface. As I did, I noticed something in the reflection, a shadowy figure standing just behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "Get a grip," I told myself. "It's probably just a trick of the light." But the feeling of unease persisted. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I finished up and decided to head home, but the whispers continued to echo in my mind. I could barely sleep that night, the image of the shadowy figure haunting my dreams. The next day, I decided to dig into the church's history. I visited the local library and searched through old newspapers and records. It didn't take long to uncover the dark truth. St. Michael's Church had a long history of disappearances. People had vanished without a trace, last seen in or near the church. Each case was shrouded in mystery, and none of the missing had ever been found. I discovered that one name appeared frequently in connection with these disappearances, a local historian named Evelyn Carter. She had been researching the church's past before she too disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Her notes, which I found in the library archives, detailed her findings about the church's dark history, including old rituals and ceremonies performed on the land before the church was built. One entry in her journal stood out: the church is a nexus of dark energies. The disappearances are connected to something ancient and malevolent. I fear I am getting closer to the truth, but I do not know if I will escape what is coming. Her words sent a chill down my spine. It seemed that Evelyn had been on the brink of uncovering something significant before she vanished. I realized that the strange occurrences I'd been experiencing might be tied to the church's dark past. That night, I decided to be more vigilant. I set up cameras in the chapel and the sanctuary, hoping to capture any unusual activity. As I worked, the whispers grew louder, filling the silence with their eerie presence. I watched the footage from the cameras and saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection of the mirror, shadows seemed to move independently of what was happening in the room. The figure I'd seen before appeared again, reaching out from the mirror as if trying to escape. Panic surged through me. I felt a cold hand grasp my shoulder and spun around to find nothing but empty air. The room grew icy, and the whispers became a cacophony of voices. "I need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. I grabbed my things and fled the church, my heart pounding in my chest. The next day, I spoke to a historian who had known Evelyn Carter. She confirmed that Evelyn had been investigating old rumors about ritualistic sacrifices connected to the church's land. The historian believed that the dark energy Evelyn had been studying might still be active, influencing the strange occurrences and disappearances. With this new information, I took precautions. I contacted a professional paranormal investigation team to examine the church and hopefully uncover the truth. I also made sure my visits were brief and that I avoided the chapel and other areas where the presence seemed strongest. The sense of being watched never fully left me, and the whispers continued to haunt my nights. I knew that the church's dark past was not something to be taken lightly, and I did my best to protect myself from becoming the next victim in St. Michael's disturbing history. As the weeks went by, the professional team reported back with their findings. They confirmed that the church was indeed a focal point for dark energies and that the disappearances were connected to something ancient and malevolent. They conducted rituals to cleanse the space, but the sense of unease lingered. For now, I continue my work at the church, though I'm always on edge. The shadows still seem to move on their own, and the whispers sometimes echo in the silence. I'm more cautious than ever, aware that the dark forces that once claimed others are still waiting, just beneath the surface. St. Michael's Church holds secrets that go beyond the bounds of normal reality, and I'm living in the midst of them. Every night I work, I feel the weight of the church's history pressing down on me, a constant reminder of the darkness that lingers just out of sight. Certainly. Here's an even more detailed and extended version. I never thought my job as a night janitor at St. Augustine's Church would be anything but routine. The old building was a relic of a bygone era, its grandeur faded but still imposing. Each night, as I worked alone in the silence, would occasionally hear the building settling, creaks and groans that I could easily dismiss as the natural noises of an aging structure. But recently, things had started to change in unsettling ways. It began a few weeks ago. At first, it was subtle, a faint whisper in the air, a fleeting shadow darting out of the corner of my eye. I'd pause, trying to catch the source of these disturbances, but there was never anything there, just the old church and its eerie quiet. I told myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me or perhaps the result of an overactive mind after long hours alone. Last night, however, was different. I was working my usual routine, mopping the floor of the sanctuary. The light from my flashlight flickered unpredictably, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. The oppressive silence was occasionally punctuated by the distant clattering of loose tiles and the soft rustling of old drapes, adding to the growing sense of unease. Just after midnight, as I was scrubbing near the altar, I heard it, a faint, scraping sound coming from somewhere behind the altar. It was so soft that I almost dismissed it, attributing it to the house settling or maybe even the wind rattling some loose boards. But the sound persisted, gradually growing louder and more insistent. My heart began to race, and an uneasy feeling crept over me. I set down my mop and approached the altar, straining to listen. The scraping noise seemed to be coming from underneath the heavy rug that covered a large section of the floor. My flashlight beam swept over the dusty surface, revealing a barely noticeable edge of a wooden panel. Curiosity and trepidation battled within me as I carefully pulled back the rug. There, partially obscured by grime, was a door, old and weathered, with intricate carvings that seemed almost out of place in the otherwise decrepit church. The door had clearly not been opened in years, and its appearance struck me as strange. It didn't fit with the rest of the church's aesthetic at all. I grabbed a crowbar from my cart, my hands shaking slightly as I worked to pry the door open. The hinges groaned under the strain, and the door creaked open to reveal an inky darkness beyond. I hesitated at the threshold, peering into the void. The air that wafted out was cold, and a musty odor filled my nostrils. The darkness was so thick that my flashlight beam barely penetrated it. Gritting my teeth, I stepped through the doorway, holding my breath as I ventured into the unknown. The passage was narrow and dank, lined with old relics and forgotten artifacts. My flashlight picked out dusty old tapestries and broken statues, their details lost to time. As I moved further down the corridor, the temperature dropped noticeably, and I began to feel a creeping sense of dread. At the end of the passage was a set of iron doors, covered in strange symbols and runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. The air was icy here, and a chill ran down my spine as I reached out to touch the door. It felt unnervingly cold against my skin. I pushed the doors open with a deep, resonant groan, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, dim light. The room was unlike anything I had ever seen. The walls were covered in faded, arcane symbols, painted in a color that seemed almost to glow faintly. In the center of the room stood a pedestal with an ancient book resting on it. The book's cover was dark and ornate, its edges worn from age. As I approached, I noticed that the book was open, and its pages were filled with a language I couldn't recognize. But one word stood out clearly, almost as if it had been deliberately highlighted: sacrifice. A cold draft seemed to swirl around the room, and a sudden gust of wind extinguished my flashlight. The darkness was now absolute, and my heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my backup flashlight. The whispers began then, low, indistinguishable murmurs that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The shadows on the walls began to move, their shapes shifting and merging into forms that I couldn't quite make out. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the increasing intensity of the whispers. I could feel a cold presence closing in on me, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The oppressive silence was punctuated by occasional thuds, like the sound of something, or someone, moving around me. A hand, cold as ice, brushed against my shoulder, sending a jolt of terror through me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I felt a surge of panic as I realized that whatever presence was in the room was not just a figment of my imagination. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My only thought was to escape, to get out of that oppressive room and away from whatever was lurking there. I turned and fled up the passage, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I could almost hear the whispers following me, growing louder and more insistent as I climbed the stairs. When I finally emerged back into the sanctuary, I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The quiet of the main church seemed almost comforting compared to the darkness I had left behind. But as I stood there, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that hidden room. The shadows in the church seemed to shift more deliberately now, and the whispers, though faint, never quite disappeared. They would come and go, always just at the edge of my hearing, as if the church itself was alive with the echoes of the room I had discovered. I don't know what I uncovered in that hidden chamber, but I have no desire to find out. I avoid the altar area now, and I always make sure to leave well before midnight. The shadows and whispers have become a constant reminder of the dark secret that lies beneath St. Augustine's church. Whatever I found down there is still waiting, and I have no intention of going back to uncover more. Each night as I work, I feel the weight of the cryptic symbols and the chilling message of the book. The shadows seem to watch me, and the whispers grow louder in the stillness. It's as if the church itself knows I've uncovered something it would rather keep hidden. And sometimes, when the night is particularly quiet and the whispers seem almost tangible, I can almost hear the book's chilling message echoing in my mind: sacrifice. It's a constant reminder of the dark secrets that lie just out of sight, waiting for someone to venture too close. I used to think my job was just a simple, if somewhat lonely, occupation. Now, I'm not so sure. The shadows have their secrets, and I'd prefer not to be a part of them. I've been working as the night janitor at St. Benedict's Church for several months now, and by this point, I thought I'd gotten used to the place. The church is ancient, its grandeur long faded into a state of disrepair. The walls are covered in peeling paint, and the once beautiful stained glass windows are now mostly cracked and grimy. The silence at night is a constant companion, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden pews or the faint rustle of old curtains. The peculiarities started small: shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking, faint whispers that I'd dismiss as my imagination. I would reassure myself that it was just the quirks of an old building. But tonight was different. There was an intensity in the air, a kind of tension that was palpable as I began my shift. I was in the process of mopping the floor near the altar when it began. The old organ, which had been silent for weeks, suddenly burst into a mournful, discordant melody. The sound was so sudden and unexpected that it made me jump. The organ pipes, covered in layers of dust, began to vibrate as if an unseen hand was playing them. "Great, just what I needed," I muttered, shaking my head. I knew I had turned off the organ before starting my cleaning, so this was a real puzzle. I set down my mop and headed toward the source of the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam flickered erratically, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to writhe along the walls. As I approached the organ, the music grew louder, more insistent. It was a haunting tune, dissonant and almost desperate. My flashlight revealed the instrument's keys moving ever so slightly, though no one was touching them. I reached out tentatively, my hands trembling. "Is someone here?" I called, my voice echoing in the vast emptiness. There was no response, just the relentless, eerie music. I examined the control panel of the organ, trying to find any explanation for the strange occurrence. Every lever and button appeared to be in the off position. "Come on," I said, frustration edging my voice as I fiddled with the switches. The music seemed to mock my efforts, growing louder with each attempt to silence it. Suddenly, the music stopped as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt almost physical. I stood there, listening to the oppressive quiet, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over me. As I turned to leave, I noticed something even more unsettling. The statues that lined the church, once silent and immobile, seemed to have come alive. Their stony eyes appeared to track my every movement. I walked past a statue of Saint Michael, and I swear his eyes followed me with a lifelike intensity. The expression on his face seemed to grow more menacing, and a chill ran down my spine. "This is just too weird," I said aloud, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. I continued my work, though I could hardly focus. The statue's gaze was unnerving, and I felt an almost tangible sense of being watched. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of dread grew stronger. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen around me. As I finished up near the altar, I noticed a dark stain on the floor, just a few feet from where the organ had been. It was an odd, irregular shape, like a footprint, but the color was too dark and the edges too blurred to be just dirt. I knelt down to examine it more closely. "What is this?" I whispered, shining my flashlight on the mark. It looked like a pool of shadow, as if someone, or something, had stepped through it. The footprint led from the organ to the altar, and it seemed to disappear into the shadows beyond. I followed the trail, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sense of being followed grew more intense, and I could feel the whispers of the organ's music still echoing in the back of my mind. When I reached the altar, I noticed something else, a faint, almost imperceptible glow coming from beneath the altar's base. I lifted the edge of the cloth that draped over it and saw a small, metal trapdoor. My heart raced as I realized there was something hidden beneath. "No way," I breathed, both fascinated and terrified. I hesitated, then forced myself to open the trapdoor. The hinges creaked loudly, and I peered into the dark space below. A narrow staircase led down into the darkness, and the air that wafted up was cold and musty. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and began to descend the stairs. The passage was damp and narrow, lined with old, cobweb-covered relics. My flashlight beam revealed old wooden crates and faded, dusty banners. As I moved deeper, the air grew colder and the sense of dread more pronounced. At the end of the passage, I came to a small chamber, its walls covered in strange, faded symbols. The room was empty except for an old, wooden chest in the center. My hands were shaking as I approached the chest. I opened it slowly, my flashlight beam revealing the contents, an assortment of old, dusty artifacts and a thick, leather-bound book. I reached for the book, carefully opening it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and cryptic symbols. One word stood out clearly: sacrifice. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and a cold breeze seemed to swirl around me. The whispers of the organ's music grew louder in my ears, and I could feel a presence closing in. I glanced around, my flashlight catching fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures moving just beyond the edges of the light. Panic surged through me. I slammed the chest shut and fled back up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The oppressive feeling followed me as I raced through the church. The statues, once again still, seemed to watch me with their eerie gaze. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and made a hasty exit, slamming the door behind me. Outside, the night air was a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere inside the church. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I didn't want to return to St. Benedict's anytime soon. The experience had left me shaken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Since that night, I've done my best to avoid the church's darker corners. The statue's eyes seem to follow me more closely now, and the whispers of the organ's music echo in the quiet of the night. I don't know what I uncovered in that hidden chamber, but I know I'm not eager to find out more. St. Benedict's Church holds secrets that are best left undisturbed, and I have no intention of uncovering them. Every night I work, I feel the weight of what I discovered, a constant reminder that the church's eerie atmosphere is more than just old age and decay. It's as if the very fabric of the building is alive with dark forces, waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. And for now, I'm content to keep my distance, letting the shadows and whispers remain just out of reach.